A very good afternoon and welcome to the session titled Building Through Disruption. My name is Nzinga Qunta. I'm a business news anchor on the public broadcaster in South Africa, the SABC. And it's my great pleasure to be moderating this discussion as we take a look at how COVID-19, compounded with geopolitical conflict and socio-economic shocks, has disrupted the global healthcare and really impacted the poor and the vulnerable the most. The last 3 years can only be described as challenging. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed inequalities along gender, race, sex, and income lives. There was also, though, so much innovation that took place. We saw growth and innovation in science and healthcare with the fastest vaccine development in history and double the investment when it came to digital healthcare. The World Economic Forum's Global Health Report and Healthcare Strategic Outlook 2023 was released last week, and that report contextualizes the current global health landscape and shows that geopolitical, economic and environmental challenges faced in 2022 place complex, interconnected threats on people's health and well-being. Today, we're going to explore how we can unlock equitable access for all while building crisis-resistant health systems, with leaders on our panel outlining the opportunities and challenges for a healthier global population. On our panel today, Seth Moulton, who's the Congressman for Massachusetts, the 6th District in the United States of America. Roy Jakobs, who's the President and Chief Executive Officer of Royal Philips. Belen Garijo, who is the Chair of the Executive Board and Chief Executive Officer of Merck. Vas Narasimhan, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Novartis, and Gianrico Farrugia, who's the President and CEO of Mayo Clinic. This session is being streamed worldwide, so a reminder to those of us watching online that the hashtag for this event is hashtag WEF23. To those of us joining us in the room, we would love to hear your questions in the second half of the session. Let's begin then. I'd like to ask our panelists to outline one issue that they consider the biggest challenge and one opportunity to make a change in 2023 for a healthier world. We'll start with you.
Thank you, and good to be here with everybody. I think, as you said, there are many advances that have happened. We still have some significant issues to deal with. We'll hear about them, I'm sure. For me, the major underlying issue is that the architecture that underlies healthcare needs to be changed. Irrespective of whether you're in a universal healthcare model or you're in a model in the United States, we still have the issue that we are in a pipeline model for healthcare. And the opportunity, therefore, becomes to move us more into a platform model that is more scalable, more accessible, and will give us better outcomes.
Coming out of the pandemic, I think we've seen that the world has faced been remarkably resilient, but also has faced incredible challenges, given that so many non-communicable diseases have really been neglected over the recent years. So I think one opportunity now for healthcare systems is to get back to really working to treat non-communicable diseases, make the early detection to prevent those diseases, and really ensure these populations have a sustainable opportunity to be healthy. I think the biggest challenge as we go into a macroeconomic environment where there's significant economic headwinds, governments are under huge pressures from a fiscal standpoint, is there will be a retrenchment on investment in healthcare, particularly in low and middle income countries. And I think we have to continue to advocate that healthcare investment is an investment for the long run, investment in economies, and ultimately an investment in the long-term success of countries.
Okay.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Thanks so much for having me. You know, one of the issues that I've spent a lot of time focusing on is mental health. And we've really had two pandemics in the last few years. One, of course, was COVID-19, but accompanying that has been a second pandemic of mental health. And really throughout human history, we have not invested much in mental health at all, certainly not in modern human history. And so there is a lot of low-hanging fruit, a lot of lives that can be saved with relatively small dollar amounts of money by investing in mental health care. And I think there are two main things we have to do. One, we have to improve access to mental health care. But the second is that we have to destigmatize mental health care so that even if access is available, people seek out that care. I passed a law in the United States to establish 988, a 3-digit mental health hotline. And it's really doing both. It's making it much easier to access mental health care. Calls are up 40% just since we established this new number. But it's also starting a conversation about mental health care that really wasn't happening before, and that's helping destigmatize the issue as well.
Well, hello everyone. Good afternoon. Happy to be here. Well, the pandemic has really been a stress test for all the healthcare systems, and I believe that we have understood what is the cost of not being prepared. During the pandemic, both across industry and between public and private sector, there was a stellar collaboration that actually helped multiply the impact and the value that we brought together to find solutions to save lives. I was very confident that after having experienced that period, governments and policymakers would be ready to move the mindset from considering health a cost to considering health and strategic investment. At the end of the day, a healthy society is a highly productive society, and therefore one could imagine that a healthy society is going to much more actively contribute to the global economic growth.
My biggest concern would be that some of the learnings that started to change the way how we deliver healthcare that we started during COVID, for example, in a much more distributed way, enabled by technology, would actually fall back as we move on to the next crisis, because the world is actually, of course, dealing with multiple crises at the same time. And as energy and climate is a very important one that we also need to deal with, and there's geopolitical tension and even warfare to deal with, it might happen that healthcare would fall back and we start to actually conduct healthcare as we were used to. And actually we should now move forward and actually build on what we started to learn and practice. And that's actually what is needed also to get much broader and wider access to care, bring it closer to where patients and people are, and actually using technology to enable that.
Okay. Belen, I want to come back to you. How has the pandemic and supply chain bottlenecks that we've seen over the last 3 years, combined with those rising costs and energy prices, impacted the production and supply of these life-saving drugs that we need?
Look, I think, well, my company is operating in 3 sectors: life science, healthcare, and electronics. And the reason I mention this is because the biggest obsession that we had when the pandemic hit, and even before the pandemic hit, was, of course, protecting our employees and preventing as much as we could possibly prevent the impact of the pandemic in our community. But the second biggest obsession that we had to do with our business continuity and supply chain continuity. So we prepared very, very well. That took tremendous efforts to be able to plan our manufacturing and production activities in a very rigorous and strategic way, let's put it that way, vis-a-vis the potential infections and the way we were going to orchestrate the whole plan. But protecting the supply chain of our critical pharma products was a key priority, and actually we were very resilient. We didn't have shortages. Now, coming to life science, we have been helping more than 50 vaccine manufacturers and many of the companies that were producing diagnostic tests. Our life science products are critical products to manufacture biologics and also mRNA vaccines and viral vector vaccines. And obviously the surge, the very rapid surge that emerged after the vaccines were approved and around the approval of the vaccines really confronted us with major challenges to produce that. How did we deal with that? Of course, we deployed a significant capital investment to be able to rapidly expand our manufacturing capacity, but most importantly, at the same time that we were doing this, we tried to regionalize our supply chain as much as possible, because of course, under the Defense Production Act in the US, we couldn't even serve the same company with products that we had or we couldn't move goods that we had in the US to the same company's factory outside of the US.
Right.
So major challenges.
Gianrico, when we're speaking about challenges, Belen's just spoken about shortages. It's predicted that by 2030 there will be a shortfall of 10 million healthcare workers. Hospitals in particular have seen this over the last 3 years. So then from your point of view, how can healthcare workers be recruited to ensure that in the next 10 years or so, there aren't going to be the kind of challenges that we've seen around healthcare workers?
So implicit in that question is that we have an acute problem that unless we do something about, will become a chronic problem. I think healthcare in general needs to better articulate our value proposition. And we actually have a very strong value proposition. There are very few sectors that you can join and you can do good, you can impact the world, you can impact patients every day. And then there's also stability. There is stability in healthcare, tends to be a very stable environment. Once you recruit, you of course have to retain. That's where flexibility comes in, but also the ability to give certainty when you can work and when you don't need to work so that you can plan your life. But more and more what we're seeing is that in healthcare, once you get into it, it's now changing so rapidly that people already in there feel threatened by new entrants into the field that bring with them digital capabilities. And so if you're there for 20 years, you start beginning to think, am I still wanted? Am I still needed? So we need to do a very good job, a better job than we currently do, to make sure that we do give people tools to feel that they're comfortable in healthcare, that they can continue to make a difference, and that in fact they're as much needed as they ever were.
Mm-hmm. Vas, when it comes to technology going forward, what innovations do you think we're going to see about drug discovery and innovations in healthcare in general in 2023?
Yeah, you know, when you think about drug discovery, these are long journeys we're on. I mean, it takes us 10 years to bring a new medicine often to market. But there have been, I think, 3 broad trends we've seen over the recent years that will continue. One is the continued advancement of what we call advanced technology platforms, technologies such as cell therapy, where we have the power now to reprogram cells in the body to treat cancer. Gene therapies, where we can reintroduce proteins that are missing in children and have dramatic effects. Various other things like siRNA and mRNA therapies, a whole world of RNA therapeutics, which the world has learned about because of the power of mRNA vaccines. I think all of these new technology areas will continue to mature. It will take a long time for them to come to fruition, but I think over the next decade, these will become critical pillars. I think 2 other big trends. One is AI, and I think you've all heard a lot about AI in the last couple of days. Now, AI goes through various hype cycles in drug discovery, and I think it's important to always think about what is the relevant use case. But there's no question now that AI has the power to accelerate certain elements of the drug discovery and drug development process. It seems to really be getting traction. I think the third innovation that I hope will happen is what we think of as population health. Can we really start to think about treating areas like cardiovascular disease at a population scale? It's the leading cause of death and disability on the planet, but we need to really tackle this at a population scale. We see examples of that. That's the only way, particularly in low and middle income countries, we're going to be able to tackle such challenges as cardiovascular disease.
Okay. Roy, when Vas is talking about technology, we saw such an uptake when it comes to digital health or telehealth among the public. As we're coming out, hopefully, and not going back of this pandemic phase, do you think that trend will continue? And what actions are needed to leverage digital health for keeping populations healthy and improving healthcare delivery as well?
I think very good question. Building on also what Gianrico said, I think first is technology availability lives by adoption by the practitioners. So technology needs to be made easy to work with, and actually we should not overload the nurses and the doctors with difficult technology solutions. Actually, we need to make it very intuitive. Secondly, it needs to be supported by a financial system that actually also sustains the use of technology. Take an example. During COVID, actually telehealth was certainly reimbursed. We see the first backtracking movements that actually the funding is taken away to actually support telehealth. Now, what that drives is actually that doctors will say, okay, if you cannot support me by having my connection with the patient virtually, and I have to pull them into the hospital to actually get it refunded or reimbursed, then actually I will start to do that again. So it's very important that next to technology, practitioner adoption, there is financing support for these new technologies. And then there's the regulatory area that also needs to actually be brought along, because we also know that there's a lot to be regulated around using the right AI, using the right technology. So that needs to come together to really scale at mass, which we all want and need. And that's something we need to drive together as an ecosystem of care, because we know the benefits it will bring to the patient.
Seth, earlier on, we've been speaking about how the pandemic really brought to light the disparities that were there and also widened them in some areas. Access to healthcare for all is a very urgent need, particularly in America, with its own challenges as well.
It's a major problem in the entire world, and there are remarkable inequities right at home for us in America. That's true. You know, a few weeks ago, my almost 2-year-old daughter got a bad case of RSV. Which is a disease that usually is not much concern, but because we all have reduced immunity, because we've been wearing masks for 2 years, it was a real problem, and I had to spend a night in the hospital with her. And she's totally fine, and she did not require any advanced mRNA therapies, no gene therapy, no cutting-edge cancer treatment. She just needed good care from good nurses at a local hospital. And how fortunate was I that 5 minutes down the road from my house is one of a hospital that's part of one of the best hospital systems in the world. But that's not true for most people in the world, and it's certainly not true even for most people in America. So as we're talking about all these exciting advancements from the pharmaceutical community and scientists and researchers, we also have to realize we have a lot of work to do just to get back to the basics of access to critical care when you have an almost 2-year-old who can't breathe. And we have a lot of work to do on that. I want to use mental health as another example here, because mental health is something that we can actually make significant progress even from far away. We have a problem in America where we don't have enough mental health providers. There are not enough mental health providers in rural Africa either. It's going to be hard, it's going to take time and resources to get those mental health providers to the communities that need them. But if we work on destigmatizing mental health, that's actually pretty easy. That's something that we can do through the internet, through public relations campaigns, through having leaders like myself talk about mental health care. A few years ago, I talked about dealing with post-traumatic stress as a Marine combat veteran in Iraq. And I've been struck by how many people all over America have come up to me and said, thank you for sharing that story, because now I'm talking about my mental health issues. And by the way, one of the best things you can do to deal with mental health is very simple. It's simply talking about it, and yet that's something that a lot of people are afraid to do.
Vas, I want to come back to a point that you made earlier on when you were talking about AI. We can't just speak about health as though it's a one sector and it's not affected by other things. So how is climate change impacting human health and well-being, and what's needed then to tackle climate change-induced public health challenges?
Look, I think we all know, and as we've discussed during this meeting, that the climate challenge is only accelerating. I mean, we see it in the data, we see it in the extreme weather events, we see it in disruptions in various parts of life. There are primary ways that climate change impacts human health, particularly in low-income and low- and middle-income countries. With a warming climate, you have many of the vectors that transmit communicable diseases able to move to other geographies up in latitude, up in altitude. And of course, that can spread malaria, dengue fever, various other communicable diseases to populations that are immunologically naive. That's one challenge. Another challenge is, as we continue to have lower and lower air quality around the world, we see increases in respiratory disease, both human-induced but also from a warming planet. And then you think about the secondary effects when crop yields go down, when fisheries collapse, when people no longer have the ability to be able to feed their families in these rural communities, also in urban communities. Then, of course, the mental health challenge that can also cause. So I think there's a lot of work to do now to better quantitate how climate change is going to impact health, but there's no question it's going to be significant. And I think we as a healthcare community can do a better job educating policymakers that climate change has many knock-on effects, including on large-scale population health.
Gianrico, there's 2 points that Vas just raised, one about the climate change and a little bit earlier on about AI and what that can do in terms of health. With so many possible scenarios just when it comes to climate change, with an eye to the future, what's the potential of AI, virtual and augmented reality, in transforming healthcare and healthcare delivery in particular?
When asked this question, I always answer the same way. We need to run towards AI, and we need to walk towards virtual reality and augmented reality, and I'll tell you why. We're all aware of the issues around AI, that we need more representative data sets. We are worried about AI bias. But all the intractable problems that we have in healthcare, including inequities, will be well served with artificial intelligence. Therefore, we as a community need to own that and run towards it. And one of the ways we've done so is we've created a coalition for health AI, which enables us to advocate for research and advocate for the right policies. I'll give you a quick example. About 3 years ago, our cardiologists found that they could use AI to diagnose heart failure 5 years before it became symptomatic on a simple electrocardiogram. Eventually, it was 6. Now it's either one lead or a digital stethoscope or even a phone, or excuse me, a watch. And now we use it to diagnose in our clinics, and we have done it for other conditions. But obstetricians realized we're doing this, and across the United States, but also in other parts of the world, especially in Africa, women have issues after pregnancy and during delivery, including heart issues. And they realized that we could use the simple electrocardiogram powered by artificial intelligence to diagnose this, and this is what we are now doing in Nigeria. There are many examples. Mental health is another perfect one, where yes, we need more people, but we will never get enough people to deal with the crisis we have. And therefore, artificial intelligence plays a huge role in enabling us to scale using a platform. Virtual reality, augmented reality, the potential is huge. I mean, we're seeing it in education, we're seeing it in planning operations, but a healthcare professional, a physician, has such little time on their hands that anything that disrupts the flow makes it much more difficult to adopt. And therefore, for augmented reality and virtual reality to really take root, we have to find better end-to-end solutions. We currently don't have them. They're disruptive to the workflow. And as long as they're disruptive to the workflow, they will not take root.
Okay. Gianrico has just pointed out the potential and the incredible work that AI can do. Roy, when it comes to data, though, there's a lack of diversity there when it comes to health outcomes. Then how can we have better quality health data that's representative of vulnerable and marginalized populations in order to continue this kind of work without that lack of diversity?
I think it's very important that we make data available at scale. I think what holds us back and actually what brings biases in if you actually have limited data sets that are not representative. So actually what we need to advocate for, and that's something we really need to step up in as health community, but especially also around the globe, is kind of how can we get to larger data sharing and sharing for the right cause. We know that there are also concerns about kind of using data, but this is actually for using data for research, actually for improving people's lives. So actually liquidating and actually getting better access to data is critical. Then also in distributing the access to data is as important. So that actually it's not only limited to a few to have access to it actually, but we make it wider available. So we need to think in an open system of healthcare where you actually can have data flow. So actually it's something we are doing within our technologies, that we make sure that we can get data from all different kind of technologies and medical devices and actually get the most holistic view of a patient and then actually work those data to give decision support to nurses or doctors. And that's where AI then comes in again to actually help us to accelerate that and do it in a much more predictive or interpreted manner. Mm-hmm. So I think providing scale to the data, making inclusion of all different population sets of the world, and actually making sure that actually we tap the knowledge from that is critical to advance an equal view of data.
Mm-hmm. Belen, what does equitable access mean, and how can we achieve equal access to health and healthcare, in particular in times of healthcare in crisis, like the ones we've seen, and in the future as well?
So let me first say that health is a universal right, right? And health equity should be, I mean, it's defined very well by WHO, and yet 2 billion people do not have access to medicines in the world, and probably many more do not have equitable access even in highly developed markets, as I mentioned before, and I think you also mentioned for some areas. So it's only through the very deep and fruitful collaboration between different stakeholders that we will be able to continuously improve access to medicines, not only in low and middle income countries, but also in those developed countries in which there are many non-communicable diseases that are still, affecting different population in different ways and dealing or leading to different outcomes. We have done a lot of work on communicable diseases in low and middle income countries. I mean, the Access to Medicines Index has been published very recently, and the two companies represented here have really made great progress on this. We have been extremely focused on fighting schistosomiasis, which is one of the most prevalent diseases in Africa, killing 250 million people a year, and we have been aiming to eliminate that disease by working with WHO and other local stakeholders in Africa to really educate and treat those patients in order to prevent and continuously improve the prevalence. And I am very, very proud to say that between, in the 10 years that we have been working on this program, we have decreased the prevalence of schistosomiasis in Africa by 60%, which is great.
Right, it's now time for us to take questions from the floor.
We are not there. So focus on communicable diseases, not yet there. So the industry is not only an industry topic. We have to give our to make our part, but obviously healthcare providers and governments have to help deal with the issue in a more productive and efficient way.
I want to bring the people in the room into the conversation as we are running out of time. Seth, I know we're still going to come back to you, but now it's time for questions from the floor. Please may you raise your hand so a mic can come to you. You can introduce yourself. If you have a specific person or panelist that you'd like the question to be answered by, please let us know. Just checking if there are any questions in the room.
Behind you.
Jonathan Jackson, Social Entrepreneur with the Schwab Foundation. During COVID, we saw just astronomical progress in certain fields when regulatory barriers were altered or adapted and changed. We also saw massive backlash on how to communicate cost-benefit and pros and cons. As you look to the future, whether it's at the hospital level, drug discovery, or regulatory, how do we learn and take what worked really well and also figure out how to overcome some of the challenges we've had on communicating this amazing scientific progress so we can move faster collectively?
Who's that for?
I can start.
Yeah, you can start. I think we can all comment on that one.
It's a reality, and I don't think the onus is only on governments. It's also on healthcare. It's also on pharma companies. We have to show benefit. So virtual care, digital care is a perfect example. You can't just layer it on the current system. It has to, in some way, make healthcare better, but also replace some of the costs. And our job in healthcare, at least at Mayo Clinic, is to make sure that we do it responsibly and we also provide the tools for others to use, but then also show outcomes. And we have to show outcomes in the shorter term. But governments have a very important role to play. And I know, at least in the United States, the 2-year extension of some of the regulatory freedom we had will enable then those outcomes to be published, so then we can have a good way forward. What we cannot forget is, however, that systems tend to regress once the stress is lifted, and therefore we have to intentionally put barriers in the way of going back. And part of our job as leaders is to create those barriers. Create those barriers so that you don't go back to where you were, but rather you create an easier path forward, a path forward that will allow us to offer hope and healing to more people.
Yeah, maybe from a drug discovery, drug development side of things, so maybe Belen, you have comments as well. I think it's first important to always remind ourselves having a strong, credible regulator is absolutely critical to have public trust in the medicines, vaccines that we develop. And if we lose that trust and there's a loss of trust in science, it would have dramatic public health consequences. So we need a strong FDA, a strong EMA, a strong WHO in terms of the global regulatory frameworks. It's very important. That said, I think we certainly learned we can be much more streamlined on clinical trials. We can be better at coordinating, particularly in a pandemic situation, across how we conduct clinical trials. I mean, some regulators showed they can move much faster when under pressure. So I think the question now is, where are the places we can learn and apply going forward, but also be aware that it's not so easy. Many of the cancer drugs or drugs we develop in other therapeutic areas have relatively small therapeutic index, which is the difference between the efficacy and the safety. In the case of the COVID vaccine, the therapeutic index was very large. Efficacy was very high, and the safety was vanishingly small issues. And so in that context, you can move extremely quickly. But when the index is low, you have to have regulators that are very rigorous to ensure that we don't lose public trust.
I think the only thing that I would like to add, I fully agree with Vas. The vaccines, for those skepticals, when vaccination came, the COVID vaccines came with one of the largest patient population that have been ever studied with a vaccine. The only thing I would really like to add is that speed is not the only issue. I think that the reassurance and trust on each and every innovation is critical, but also we can improve. What I believe we can improve is really being a bit more consistent, right, across the different regulatory agencies, because we frequently see that not only in terms of timelines, but also in terms of evaluation criteria driving approvals, or early or late approvals, or regular approvals, the criteria are not always consistent, and these may eventually trigger inequitable access to innovation in many different geographies, or in the different geographies.
Mm-hmm. We need 2 mics there, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ayman Tamer from Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. I wanted to shed some question or inquiry, Congressman, on mental health. I attended a session this morning, and it was about mental health in the workplace and the concern about it. And they're talking figures, 2 out of 5 today are suffering with mental health, especially after COVID. And then when we started having panels, we broke down, and I realized today in schools post-COVID, you have counselors and coaches, and you're having maybe 1 out of 2 of the students are going to see coaches and counselors. So our future pipeline is really in a bad situation. And I wanted to know, what's the role of the private sector and the public sector? And what are we going to do about this issue that's being really today neglected and becoming so important, not only in the workplace, but also in the schools and in the youth?
Thank you.
It's a great question. And for all the mental health problems that the adult population has throughout the globe, many of them stemming from COVID, but in many cases, COVID simply exposed many of the mental health conditions that have existed for a long time. All the studies show that it's worse with kids. And this is frightening when we think about the future. But I want to start answering this question by just stating something that's probably obvious to all the experts in the room, but is not obvious to everybody in the general population, which is that you can cure these issues. You can cure these. I mean, I'm living proof of someone who has dealt with post-traumatic stress successfully, and now I'm a sitting member of Congress. So that's an important message to understand, is that if we attack this problem among our youth, we can get them ready for the future. If we take mental health care seriously, we will make a stronger world community. In America, we will make a stronger country if we deal with our mental health issues. It's going to require collaboration between the private sector and the public sector. The point's already been made that we do not have the mental health resources. AI is going to have to be a part of this, at least in the initial stages of diagnosis. But what has to happen first is we have to establish as a value that we're actually going to address this. And that's not a shared value. It's not just this issue of the stigmatization of mental health. It's an issue of funding. That's right. That's right. So that's something that I'm working very hard on in the U.S. Congress. We work very hard to make sure that it's a bipartisan issue. We always emphasize that this bill that we passed to establish this 3-digit mental health hotline is a bipartisan bill. We want everyone to know that all of Congress, representing very diverse communities in America, is behind this.
Right. Other questions from the floor? There's one over there. Behind me, and then one. Can we have some diversity in the answers? So we'll start with her, and then we'll go back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the floor. I'm a Brazilian diplomat, former ambassador of Brazil to the WHO. So I'm going to start saying that I was very happy to see the CEO of Merck speaking about access to medicine in Africa, and I'm sure in other countries from the developing world. This is very, very important. My question is, yesterday we were here in the same room talking about ending tuberculosis. And one of the conclusions of the meeting was that tuberculosis is a pandemic. It's killing as much as COVID-19. And we are developing vaccines and medicines to deal with tuberculosis. Since we have so many CEOs of important companies, I would like to know, how are we doing from the point of view of the private sector? And if you allow me, just a quick question for the CEO of Mayo Clinic. Pardon my ignorance, I didn't understand the conclusion of your statement when you said that you have developed a technology to early detection of heart problems. Are you using this technology or not? I did not.
So I'll answer quickly so we can move on. Every day on every one of our patients.
Very good news. Thank you.
Yeah, I think on the topic of tuberculosis, first I'd say the industry overall, I'd say as an industry we've neglected these called neglected diseases for many, many years. I think some companies do make it a priority. I'm proud to say for Novartis, we are always part of the KGaA declaration. We just recently committed $250 million of R&D research on neglected diseases. We have an entire unit that only works on developing drugs for neglected, not tuberculosis, unfortunately, but many other neglected diseases, particularly novel therapeutics for malaria, for leishmaniasis, for various cryptosporidiosis and diarrheal diseases. So it's a real priority for us to continue that work. But I would say as a sector, we could do more. And tuberculosis is not a great success story. When you look at it, the second-line treatments, multi-drug resistant tuberculosis therapies have been around for decades. We haven't really come up with new medicines. In general, vaccine development for intracellular bacteria like tuberculosis and for parasitic diseases is very daunting and challenging. And so very good alliances were set up, Global Alliance for TB Drug Development, the TB Vaccine Alliance, but have largely been unsuccessful. So I'm optimistic, broadly speaking, on neglected tropical diseases because of the efforts of the Gates Foundation and others to galvanize the industry. On tuberculosis, it's a tough haul.
Okay.
Fully agree. Nothing to add.
All right. Checking if there's any further questions from the floor. We've got about 7 minutes left, and we still need closing remarks. So
There's another
maybe we
question
get a
there.
mic there, and then a mic behind me as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fayyad Dendashi, Saudi Arabia. My question is general for all executives on healthcare workers. A bit long question, but to deliver the message. Healthcare cost has been somehow controlled, except, for example, in the US. And manpower supply has been somehow taken for granted. But today, especially after COVID, we see a threat and a turbulence in the supply. For example, 1 out of 3 nurses are thinking to switch or shift career moving forward. Pharmaceutical products, other products have been somehow tamed in terms of cost control. Are the big players, the global players, envisaging or contemplating what could happen if that for granted supply of healthcare workers being disrupted for a reason or so? What will happen to the healthcare cost, and what will happen in particular to the service provision element of the healthcare?
I mean, I can take. I can only agree, and this has been particularly acute in some of the European countries that scale up very quickly to deal with the crisis, and then, scale down also very quickly, generating scarcity because the pandemic is not over, and we have peaks, and then this is being felt. So, it goes back to my previous statement that health and healthcare is still seen as a cost, right? And we need to drive and to help drive this mindset shift that is necessary so that health is considered a state issue, not the health minister issue, and is managed as a strategic investment, because this is the way it is. And this is mainly happening in those countries that in which public funding is deployed to health, right? Because probably the US is a little bit of a different environment in this context. So that's my position. I don't know if any.
All right. If I can ask for just one question in a minute and a 1-minute response, and then we're going to get some closing remarks.
Well, thank you for this discussion. My name is Roman. I'm from Ukraine. I'm a global shaper, and also I'm anesthesia resident from the biggest hospital in Ukraine, which assists all victims from the places of active hostilities. And so our healthcare system has severe challenges during this war: severe blast injuries, mental health problem, post-traumatic stress disorder, insufficient nutrition for newborns, and so on, prosthesis, and so on. And so I understand that these challenges should, the best specialists in the world should work on these challenges. So what is the best way we need to do right now? Thank you.
Thank you. Roy?
Yeah, I think very fair call out. We had a session this morning. Indeed, I think 1,000 hospitals have been destroyed. So active care is being denied as we speak. I think there's acute need for support on the ground. And indeed, I think we need to come together as healthcare community, which we are, I think, also doing. There's a lot of help deployed, both where it's mobile hospitals that are being brought in, where it's specialized experience to deal with, indeed, cases that traumatized soldiers are dealing with. I think at the same time, and that's also actually we are discussing already with the Ukrainian government, how we leapfrog the infrastructure after the war. Because this is also an opportunity to think differently about populating the healthcare system in the Ukraine. And actually it's great to see that actually we have both discussions at the same time, because we need to think here and now and solve the immediate, very urgent issue at hand, but then also make sure that we have an infrastructure in place once hopefully this war is soon over and we can rebuild again.
All right. Thank you all so much for your time and input. It's been such a privilege to be part of this discussion that brought about tangible solutions and answered very big questions in the healthcare space. I'd like to please ask Shyam Bishen to give us some closing remarks here at the World Economic Forum.
Thank you. Thank you very much for giving me a couple of minutes. I just wanted to bring the World Economic Forum perspective into this. First of all, when we talk about the funding and the budget issue here and the cost issue, Belen, you're totally right. We want to make sure that we treat any kind of investment in healthcare as investment and not as a cost. And I think some of you were there yesterday morning. We had a meeting on healthcare policy where we had some of the health ministers. We also brought in the finance ministers. It was moderated by Right Honorable ex-Prime Minister of UK, Tony Blair. And it was good to see that the finance ministers are finally realizing that, yes, it is an investment. It is not a cost. So I think we have a long way to go. It's just the beginning. But COVID has certainly made people realize that, yes, we need to treat this, any kind of funding to healthcare, as an investment. So that's one. Secondly, we do see that costs are out of control. I don't believe that it's just the US problem. Sure, US is huge. US is close to $5 trillion out of the $12 trillion in terms of the overall healthcare spending, which has gone from $8.5 trillion in 2018 to $12 trillion in 2022. It's almost 50% increase. Not all of it is coming from US. Big part of it is agri. China, look at them, how the cost is running up there. How do we control it? How do we control that cost? That's also an issue here. One of the things is looking at digital technologies. I think we already had some discussion on that. Telemedicine was heavily used during COVID. It's still being used. The Indian minister was telling us that 250,000 calls were being made during pandemic. How can we capitalize on that? How can we make sure that we use those technologies to, again, make it much more cost effective? I know I'm given signal to stop. So let me stop here then. But thank you all. I want to thank the moderator, esteemed speakers, and everyone for being here and participating in this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Great job.